entire community of concerned leaders in and out of Canada are saying the same thing. Canada is next. And what is next for Canada is not just a pogrom, but possibly mass dispossession on a Nazi scale.
And now, The Edwin Black Show. Sponsored by the books of Edwin Black, available on Amazon and at booksellers worldwide. And now, here's Edwin.
Hello, everyone. I'm Edwin Black, investigative journalist, historian, and human rights author of 250 editions in 40 languages in 190 countries worldwide, including IBM and the Holocaust, War Against the Weak, and the Farhud, as well as many other books. This is a show for opinion makers and decision makers, not mass clicks. So if you think our show's content is meaningful, spread the word throughout your most informed networks. Subscribe for alerts at theedwinblackshow.com. And if you want to support our work, we need your assistance. Please visit theedwinblackshow.com/support. Your help, big or small, assures our complete and utter intellectual and uncensored journalistic independence. Go to theedwinblackshow.com/support and keep us independent. Today's episode is made possible and sponsored without any preconditions, requests, or stipulations by the 4th edition of Ken Abramowitz's incisive bestseller, The Multi-Front War, available everywhere, where you're not going to want to miss this. And if you would like to honor someone with a sponsorship, contact us. That said, remember, I only speak for myself and for history. The same goes for my guests. Today, we welcome viewers from across America, including our 4 watch parties in the Villages, Newton, Mass., Chicago, and Tampa Bay. Overseas, I see viewers logged on from most of our usuals: Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, Canada, of course, Germany, Holland, France, Italy, Spain, Poland, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, of course, Panama, and Israel, plus other countries. If you have a question, place one short sentence in Zoom's QA feature. The Edwin Black Show, along with our YouTube site, speaks frankly and without tremor to a fragmented world seeking better understanding of our tormented past, our present very, very tense, and a turbulent future still uncertain. By the way, stay tuned for my special word of wisdom at the very end of the show, just before I sign off. Before we dive into our historic Farhud Day show, let's cover some pressing current topics. Item 1, we start with the Trump 2.0 update. Many are confused about Trump's plan to reindustrialize the United States, his tariff policy, and his spend now, get benefit later strategy. His plan can be explained simply. Trump is thinking about America's economy like he would think about a skyscraper. He's going to expend an enormous amount of resources and incur displacement to build the skyscraper. Then he's going to sell the condominiums and make a fortune, but this time it's going to be for the country. It's not instantaneous, and as our country's leader, he needs the ability to wheel and deal to rectify years of economic inequality between us and our trading partners, especially in Europe. We're already seeing the fruits of this undertaking. Food and oil prices have dropped. Jobs are up. The fickle stock market made a full recovery after a few weeks, and his job approval rating continues to remain high. And with Hispanics, by the way, his poll numbers are at 60%. Remember, the legacy media wants to focus and magnify the negative. We must recognize that America and society has changed over recent decades. The establishment media, such as the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, ABC, NBC, NPR, and their partners, can no longer be trusted on many key issues. These media players committed a string of unpardonable credibility-killing crimes of misreporting, news faking, and cover-ups that astonishes those of us committed to and dependent upon honest journalism. These gargantuan fakes include the Russia hoax, the Hunter Biden laptop blackout, the pernicious reporting on the Israel-Gaza war, and the massive cover-up of President Biden's mental decline that saw a cabal of White House controllers running the country and almost certainly commandeering the presidential auto pen to sign hundreds of presidential orders, acts of legislation, and more than 1,000 sudden pardons. Just one of these media crimes should be enough to sink a media outlet. But this groaning glissando of continuous cover-ups, reporting blackouts, fake-outs, and gaslight campaigns is journalistic RICO that amounts to more than malfeasance. It constitutes collusion, in some cases, criminal conduct that must be purged from our society. This includes the monstrous willful blindness when it comes to Biden's incapacity and a White House staff soft coup, seizing control of the government, and this, of course, includes the petroliferous enrichment of Putin, stimulating his war, and even the nuclear codes. Prosecution over expropriation of the auto pen are coming, but those will only be the beginning. Item 2, the media is not the only tower to transmogrify in America's new awareness. Academia, long a bastion of hate, racism, and social upheaval, has now been exposed for what it has long been. I recall that every genocide I've studied that occurred over the past 200 years had its roots and encouragement on university campuses. We look at Harvard, a frontline leader in America's own genocide. I speak of the eugenics program of mass sterilization, mass euthanasia, and social disenfranchisement, which was later adopted and emulated by the Third Reich and its own genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of other Europeans. If you wish to know more, consult my bestseller on the topic. That's War Against the Weak. You can read more about Harvard's eugenic crimes in that volume that were qualified and defined as genocide under the International Genocide Treaty. Who knew that this private university with a $53.2 billion trust fund, and which gets additional billions in public funding, would last year alone rake in $686 million. Yet its student body is about 27% comprised of foreign students from 150 countries, and Communist China leads the list. Among its top 4 foreign donors is the toxic Qatar regime, as well as the UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. That's more than $94 million, and that's just from 2020 to 2024. Harvard's systemic anti-Semitic ways are appalling, but it did not begin with the immoral admission of now disgraced and resigned Harvard president Claudine Gay when she was asked about calls to exterminate the Jews and said, well, quote, it depends on the context. In 1922, Harvard President A. Lawrence Lowell advocated a quota of 15% for Jewish students, and his suggestion was broadly supported by the student body and faculty. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Harvard welcomed the Third Reich with academic exchanges and partnerships, specifically with those German universities that had fired their Jewish professors, such as the University of Heidelberg. One of Hitler's earliest and most important aides was his foreign press secretary, Ernst Hansteigel. And yes, Hansteigel was a Harvard man who in 1934 returned to the campus in a triumphant visit. Hansteigel ran around Harvard giving Heil Hitler salutes to wild applause and goose-stepping students and professors. The Harvard Crimson newspaper editorialized, quote, if Herr Hauptstangl is to be received at all, it should be with the marks of honor appropriate to his high position in the government of a friendly country, a great world power. Harvard's administration ensured that 7 anti-Nazi protesters that day were arrested and sentenced to 6 months of hard labor at Middlesex before eventually being pardoned. In 1935, as the Nuremberg laws were being passed, Hitler's top diplomat in Boston was invited to ceremoniously place a swastika-bedecked wreath at a Harvard chapel. Last night, famed former Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz claimed he had been banned from campus merely for his pro-Trump legal comments, and when he was finally able to finagle a speaking event, it was forced off campus and his security guard had to be doubled. This week, Dershowitz stated, quote, Harvard is not only tolerating anti-Semitism in 2 of its schools, the Divinity School and the Public Health School, it's actually teaching and fomenting anti-Semitism. That's a quote. So it is Trump against the epicenter of genocidal eugenics, the Nazi race policy, the anti-Semitic traditions and current attitudes, which has become a host campus for Hamas agitation, and even recently honored 2 students videotaped harassing a Jewish student. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Harvard, and just behind them are numerous other elite universities which maintain ivory towers built on foundations of hate, anti-Semitism, and anti-Americanism. It's time for some of those towers to come down. Item 3, Jews are imperiled around the world. The implicit threat of hate speech has now escalated not only to fire bombings of Jewish institutions, but the natural consequence of intimidation and violence against visibly Jewish people. Several times each day I receive reports. For example, a Jewish boy at the Hampstead Underground in London, in the heart of a heavily Jewish neighborhood, was beaten bloody simply because he looked Jewish. Earlier this week, a violent pro-Palestinian mob swarmed the Orthodox Jewish Center of Lubavitch in Brooklyn, where black guys deliberately, with their keffiyehs waving, screamed terrible obscenities at women and children, and one guy even pulled his pants down to moon his bony ass at the passive Jewish people. Hate speech is not protected speech. Violent speech is not protected speech. When screaming rioters wave placards saying by any means necessary, which is self-explanatory, and globalize the Intifada, which means kill the Jews, and hoist a poster calling to, quote, exterminate Zionists, as we saw in 2023, this is before October 7th, and then that exterminate Zionist call from a Chicago group known as the Party for Socialism and Liberation sees a member of its group, Elias Rodriguez, travel to the Jewish Museum in Washington, and then we see the end game of such rhetoric. There at the museum, he gunned down 2 beautiful Israelis from the embassy engaged in aid discussions for Gaza. Yaron Lashinsky, 30, and Sarah Lynn Milgram, 26, a woman whom my daughter knew when she cantored for a synagogue in Kansas City. Killer Rodriguez didn't just shoot them. He fired 21 bullets at these wonderful people, and even pumped a bullet into the back of Miss Milgram as she was crawling away. This is a cancer, no different from the cancer of slavery and race hatred perpetrated by the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War, which led to the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which dismantled the Klan in its 19th century iteration before it rose again under Woodrow Wilson and the Democratic Party racists and Jim Crow partisans of the early 20th century. So call it for what it is. Free Palestine is the new Heil Hitler. Globalize the Intifada means kill the Jews. This is hate speech. Don't write a paragraph of explanation. Just think it, say it, and shout it. Free, free Palestine is the new Heil Hitler. And those who scream it are part of the unbroken military and diplomatic alliance that arose between the Nazis and the Arabs during World War II, led by the Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, that created 3 Waffen-SS divisions in Central Europe, and that picked up the battle after the fall of Hitler, and now they have changed a few syllables, and their new battle cry is Free, Free Palestine. The very words that Rodriguez chanted proudly after he murdered those 2 Israeli staffers. Today, student groups are in fact posting heroic posters paying homage to the killer Rodriguez and inviting the next killing, even mass killing, such as we saw at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. Ironically, we are in an extraordinary position to mount countermeasures. America and the entire human rights world has been blessed by the presence and determination of President Donald J. Trump and his whole of government approach to two-fisted, hands-on measures to dismantle anti-Semitism and expunge it from our streets and campuses. The world witnessed an extraordinary event never before seen in human rights history recently in the Oval Office as Donald Trump ambushed the South African president Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa over what was called white genocide in his country. Specifically, Trump shocked Ramaphosa by playing a video of the minority EFF party screaming chants of kill the farmer and kill the Boer, including in this to a cheering crowd of 90,000 in a giant stadium. I have the United Nations copy of the Genocide Treaty before me. It states clearly under the definition in Article 2 that, quote, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, and it lists A, killing members of the group. And in Article 3, paragraph sub C, it specifies that genocidal crimes, I've got it right here, ladies and gentlemen, genocidal crimes occur with, quote, direct and public incitement to commit genocide. That's why Stryker and that's why the other Nazi propagandists were called before the bar in Nuremberg. By any measure, whether they are only preliminarily successful or even unsuccessful, the kill the farmer movement is clearly genocide. We have yet to see whether this first in human rights advocacy produces an improvement on the ground. But this segues into our main topic and a historic show it will be. Many of you know that I wrote a turning point bestseller, The Farhud, chronicling the Arab-Nazi alliance in the Holocaust. That's right here, which chronicled the forgotten Arab-Nazi pogrom of June 1st, June 2nd, 1941 in Baghdad, known as the Farhud, which means violent dispossession. In this 2-day melee of bloodlust, children were killed in front of their parents, parents were killed in front of their children, mass rapes and beheadings ensued. Save your messages, people. I already know these words that I wrote in 2010 sound like October 7th. I know this. Anyway, the book started a global movement of remembrance that blossomed into the creation of International Farhud Day, which I announced from the floor of the United Nations during a live globally streamed event. Since then, June 1, June 2 is observed worldwide as International Farhud Day. 2 years ago, I predicted the next Farhud would be in Israel, and months later, we witnessed October 7th. Now I have another sad prediction, and that is the next Farhud is coming to Canada. But this time I'm not alone or ahead of the curve. An entire community of concerned leaders in and out of Canada are saying the same thing. Canada is next. And what is next for Canada is not just a pogrom, but possibly mass dispossession on a Nazi scale. And now I read the words of the Jewish Community Council of Montreal to the Canadian government, published a few days ago. Quote, since October 7th, the Jewish community of Montreal has faced an unprecedented surge in anti-Semitic hate crimes. Synagogues have been firebombed. Jewish day schools have been attacked. I'm quoting. Our institutions have been defaced. Our families intimidated. Our children made to feel unsafe in their own city. The rise in hostility has been sharp, visible, and traumatic. Close quote. I add, a just completed Israeli ministerial study of global anti-Semitism, citing a 670% rise in anti-Semitic incidents in Canada from 2023 to 2024, and an astonishing 1,500 noisome anti-Jewish and anti-Israel protests in Toronto last year. The daily violence, the acquiescence, and indeed tacit approval of the Trudeau government caused the Free Press to publish an exhaustive expose headlined, quote, the explosion of Jew hate in Trudeau's Canada, close quote, with a subhead crying, it was like a dam burst. Earlier this month, the Free Press followed up with an article headlined, quote, a pogrom is brewing in Canada, featuring the subhead, the days of exclusionary signs at golf clubs have been replaced by open calls for jihad in Jewish neighborhoods. This will not end well, close quote. The culprits are not motorcycle guys with mangy beards. It is the Arab street, increasingly wild and out of control in Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa, and across our northern neighbor every day, escalating their level of threats and violent outbursts. Today, just before we went on the air, Canadian Senator Leo Housakos, leader of the loyal opposition, who rose in Parliament to admit, quote, Jews are no longer safe in Canada. I'm going to read that again. The head of the opposition party in Parliament said Jews are no longer safe in Canada. That's a fact, I'm quoting him, not a feeling. And we as politicians, he said, are in no small part to blame, close quote. He admitted that Jews do not feel safe because, in fact, they are not safe. The new government of Mark Carney is no better and perhaps worse. Carney's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Anita Anand, is a vocal critic of Israel and working hard to delegitimize and isolate the state. And now we are confronted by, believe it or not, believe this or not, the Nakba Act, which will create a national day of mourning for the so-called Nakba. That is the day the Arab War of Extermination against the Jews in Israel failed in 1948, and Israel was able to successfully declare its independence after the UN vote for partition into two states. This law creates a crime of anti-Palestinian racism by just denying the Nakba or advocating back against false Palestinian claims. It criminalizes all sorts of engagement with the state of Israel. And already, even before it passes, the largest school district in Canada with jurisdiction over 250,000 children promises to adopt and teach the basics of this proposed law even before it passes. Critics warn this will virtually ban the Star of David on the necklace chains of children. This is what Nazi Germany did to the Jewish children, forced them to endure anti-Jewish teachings in their own schools. So what do we do now? A press release, a Jewish rights website, a new hate speech app, another speech by me? I'm coming from a different world. I'm coming from the world of the 12-year Holocaust. My first best-selling book was the transfer agreement. 1984. And it chronicled the rise and might of the anti-Nazi boycott from the first weeks of the Third Reich in 1933 to the bitter end in 1945. A highlight of that boycott was the ignition event, March 27, 1933, when Stephen Wise and his American Jewish Congress, along with a broad interfaith coalition, staged a 1 million-man march on Madison Square Gardens, demanding Hitler stop his campaign of persecution. Hitler, of course, did not desist, and quickly the protest movement enlarged into a full-fledged international boycott of Nazi goods and anything German. Hear me, I'm going to make history right now by walking in the steps of Stephen Wise and that anti-Nazi movement. I'm calling for exactly what the Nakba Act and its advocates against Israel are calling for. But I ask it against Canada. I call for drastic and immediate measures to isolate, sanction, and boycott Canada. Yes, the Canada we love, the Canada of friendship, which has now descended into its anti-Semitic roots, recalling that when Holocaust refugees sought refuge in Canada, the widespread response was, quote, "None is too many." I am asking Trump to restrict our northern border, which right now has become one of the central sources of fentanyl pouring into this country. I want Trump to apply a hate tariff. Let me say it again. You've never heard it before. A hate tariff. That is a kind of import surcharge that has been discussed for climate control and other activities. I ask trade to be strangled to a trickle. Push Canada out of NORAD and NATO. We don't need them under these circumstances. Folks, cancel your winter ski vacations in one of the most beautiful places on earth, offering some of the nicest people. But to paraphrase a slogan from the anti-Nazi boycott of the 1930s, crack Canada before Canada cracks its Jews. Some of us will remember that no one believed the land of Mozart and Bach would suddenly explode into the Third Reich as it did after January 30th, 1933. No one here would believe that Canada would explode as a so-called post-national state, hosting, tolerating anti-Jewish dangers and violence and legislation which will only get worse from here. The Nakba Act must not pass, even though Parliament is already responding with positive welcomes. The boycott and sanction of Canada must be monumental, except for actions to ameliorate and improve. Many Canadians I talk to are now asking how they can escape Canada with their property and to where. This is what we heard in Nazi Germany in the 30s. And many Canadians are afraid to even speak up for fear that the new Canadian government, which has proven its willingness to crush criticism and free speech, they're afraid of that. In fact, one such Canadian is with us today. He is a leading, internationally respected analyst, but afraid to express himself with name and face showing, and even afraid to disguise his voice lest AI systems be used to unmask him. So this prominent Canadian is now with us, his identity masked, and his message will be read to us by one of our contributing editors who specializes in security and intelligence. I give you Claire Lopez, who will now read the words of our Canadian panelist who fears reading them himself. Take it, Claire, and thank you for reading words that you did not write, but which must be heard. Take it, Claire.
Yes, thank you. So, quote, like a cat toying with an injured mouse, President Trump might be delighting in the chaos north of the border, but many Canadians are troubled by the chaos, by the corruption, the collusion, the complacency, and the conspiratorial attitude of the current and last federal governments that are hard to tell apart. The current and former prime ministers have the same staff, advisors, and ministers. Canada has attained the dubious distinction of being the country with the fastest rising rate of anti-Semitic incidents. Current and previous governments have condoned it, allowed it to fester, and institutionalized it. 2 years ago, Hamas thanked Justin Trudeau for voting for a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. Not to be outdone, Canada's freshly minted Prime Minister, Mark Carney, joined with France and the UK in calling for Israel to stop military operations in Gaza. Hamas issued a public statement thanking them for their support. Some of the country's largest labor unions stridently support Palestine, even if their Jewish union members feel threatened. In the country's largest urban centers, Hamas supporters have held weekly marches. With faces completely covered by keffiyehs, they are unrelenting as they burn and stomp on Israeli flags, yell that Jews are baby killers and Nazis, that Zionists and Jews should be killed, and that Israel should be destroyed. Toronto's keffiyeh-wearing mayor has been conspicuously silent as pro-Hamas militants openly celebrate the murder of Jews, block roads, vandalize Jewish-owned businesses, firebomb synagogues, fire bullets into Jewish day schools, promote intifada, and call for the death of all Jews, as police stand by watching while the activists exert their charter-protected right to free expression and freedom of association. Canada's largest school board, with nearly 600 schools, has just formally recognized, quote, anti-Palestinian racism. So students, staff, and parents who wear a Magen David or a yarmulke or have a bring them home ribbon on their backpack can now be accused of being anti-Palestinian and racist. Throughout more than 18 months of escalating aggression by pro-Hamas demonstrators, police have made token arrests, but with a revolving door justice system, they're not held. Many people have wondered why Canadians don't do something about the scandal-plagued government that has created a housing crisis, economic crisis, unaffordable national debt, and out-of-control immigration. How can they tolerate the lies, corruption, collusion, and disdain the government has for Canadians without doing something about it? And the answer is simple. Lawmakers have made sure Canadians can do nothing about it, as some MPs wear keffiyehs in Parliament and Jewish staff hide their Magen Davids. Even the Liberal members of Parliament, who were so eager to get rid of their former leader, refused to enact a law that would give them the power to dethrone their party leader. Meantime, many Canadians, including Jews, are increasingly careful about what they say, what they post online, what they wear, and where they go. As Senator Leo Hausakos said in the Senate,
Jews are no
quote,
longer safe in our country.
Jews are no longer safe in our country. It's not that they feel unsafe, they are unsafe. End quote.
Antisemitism and Jew
Wow.
hatred is now.
Did you write those words?
No, I did not. I read them for you.
And being one of our most knowledgeable analysts, were you aware of the depth of anti-Jewish activity, violence, and agitation in Canada prior to this moment?
Yes, it's all over the news. It's everywhere online. Yes, it's very obvious. There's no way to hide it.
All right. The person who is known as Canadian on our show right now, whose face and name is not showing, that person is now invited to go into the public chat. The only thing that will show is the name Canadian. And would you verify that the words read by Claire are in fact the words that you wrote and intended to be shown to our audience? Just go in there and make a comment. It'll be in the publicly available chat. Claire read my words verbatim, and I thank her for that. Okay, so now we're going to turn it over to someone who has studied this issue, not from around the world, not from across the country, but from right next door. I speak of the president of the Zionist organization in Michigan, who's located in Detroit, just across the bridge from Canada, a frequent visitor there and a frequent observer of the anti-Semitic actions going on in Canada. Shell, take the screen. Tell us what you know.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Edwin. Amazingly powerful words, and thank you, Claire, for reading those words. Let me give some background that will help color and highlight everything we've been hearing. In November 2024, matter of 6 months ago, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly's 70th session was held in Montreal, and rioters organized by the Divest for Palestine organization wreaked havoc on the city. They ignited smoke bombs, threw metal barriers into the street, smashed windows of businesses and the convention center where the NATO delegates were meeting. They torched cars, burned an effigy of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, and openly called for the final solution of Jews. Police only arrested 3. Meanwhile, Canadian ministers described it as a violent anti-Semitic demonstration that were an act of anarchy by a mob. And while Montreal burned, then Prime Minister Trudeau was dancing and handing out friendship bracelets at a Taylor Swift concert in Toronto, and it took him 24 hours to weigh in with a single tweet. Since October 2023, the number of drive-by shootings at Jewish schools in Montreal and Toronto have been enormous. Coordinated bomb threats have targeted 100 Jewish institutions. Synagogues have been firebombed. One Toronto synagogue was vandalized 7 times in a year. An elementary school was a target of 2 drive-by shootings. Jewish businesses were targeted and routinely vandalized. Jews were besieged by pro-Palestinian protesters, in quotes. I call them pro-Hamas supporters in their own neighborhoods. Jewish parents worry about sending their children to kindergarten. Jewish university students from across Canada are afraid to attend classes, and violent attacks include shootings and arson attacks targeting schools, synagogues, and community institutions. Members of the largest Canadian synagogue in Toronto go through a guarded back door to enter the building. Yet parishioners at the nearby Timothy Eaton Church do not. They just merely walk through the front door of their church unmolested. And Montreal, from what we've heard, is now considered the most dangerous city for Jews in North America. We've heard about the huge increase in anti-Semitic attacks against Jews in Canada. Police say they cannot keep up with the attacks. And by the way, in Canada, the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement and policies, the only group that it excludes are Jews. As Edwin has said, as Claire has read, anti-Semitism is now normalized in Canada, and no other minority group faces these challenges. In 2015, when Trudeau and his Liberal Party came into power, Trudeau vowed to make Canada the first post-national state. Trudeau was determined to swell Canada's population with immigrants, temporary workers, and foreign students to boost the country's gross domestic product. Huge numbers of immigrants streamed into Canada. Canada's GDP per capita growth in many years only grew 0.6%. In fact, amongst the third lowest amongst the OECD developed countries. So Canada has not benefited from this projected economic growth. In fact, Canada is contracting with huge inflation. Meanwhile, Muslim advocacy organizations quickly rose to unprecedented influence in Trudeau's Canada. The Muslim Association of Canada, which is guided by the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, the parent organization of Hamas, has taken in millions of dollars from the Canadian federal government in, quote, anti-hate, unquote, funding. And this Muslim entity routinely invites foreign speakers to deliver anti-Semitic and homophobic sermons. It's interesting that in a national population of 41 million people in Canada, there's an estimated 1.8 million Muslims. 1 out of 20 Canadians are Muslim, twice as many as 20 years ago. More than 40% support suicide bombing against Israelis. Over 1/3 say Jews are not entitled to a state of their own. And a majority of these Muslims describe Israel as an apartheid state and Zionism as racism. That is what Canada is looking like today. The toxic ideas about Jews have merged with critical theory to bring the country to a frightening juncture. Canada has now entered a dark and terrible period of systematic, normalized, institutionalized Jew hatred. As Edwin described the anti-Palestinian racism concept that's becoming normalized, as an example, a governmental minister had to step down from their role because they came out and supported and described Israel's miraculous growth and advancement since 1948. Because that was considered anti-Palestinian racism, that minister was forced from their position. So I charge Canadian officials for evading their duties to protect Canadian citizens. This includes federal, provincial, municipal, judicial, and university officials of failure to enforce Canadian laws. The media is complicit in failing to really describe the problem as immoral and illegal. In fact, the media is not exposing the official malfeasance, and they're basically advancing anti-Jewish libels. We have a horrible situation in Canada, as Edwin said, reminiscent of the 1930s. And this anti-Nakba law, if it passes Parliament, is going to advance the anti-Israel, anti-Jewish racism even worse.
Thank you for that unfortunate recitation. So, Shel, you've been following this for quite a while. You know your history. What do you advocate that people do besides just issue a press release?
Canadians need to apply pressure to their officials, write to the officials, call the officials. These officials are abdicating their responsibility. And as we've seen in history for thousands of years, when Jews are targeted, they're not the only group that is targeted. They're merely the canary in the coal mine. They're the first group. After the Jews, the society will go after the next group. We've seen in the Middle East what's happened to the Christians. With the Muslim growth and influence in Canada, after they, God forbid, eradicate the Jews and eliminate the Jews, will they go after the Christians in Canada? The Canadian citizens need to apply huge pressure to their officials.
How do we motivate the average citizen, good person, friendly person, neighbors that we know? How do we motivate them to pick up the phone and tell their local, provincial, and federal officials, no more, take action? What do we got to do?
I think there needs to be a strong public campaign funded by significant money to have ads in the newspapers, billboards, radio ads. Here in the United States, a billionaire on the East Coast, a sports team owner, that started Stop Anti-Semitism and put up billboards and subway signs and advertisements in the football Super Bowl. Now, is it having an effect? We don't know yet, but it was a strong public message that needs to go on in Canada.
Our Canadian friend who said PM Carney said he's going to limit immigration to a mere 5%, which is over 2 million people in a country of just over 40 million. And even the Bank of Canada, Carney's former employer, where he was governor, said the out-of-control immigration has decimated employment possibilities for Canada. I'm now going to call in one of really our most distinguished and knowledgeable historians of the Holocaust with a deep, granulated knowledge of the Holocaust and what was going on before the war and from the very first moments of the Third Reich. I want to bring in Samuel Edelman, who is currently near Fort Lauderdale. Sam, tell us what you think about the current situation and what do you think we should do about it?
I have been thinking about what really describes, especially the Nakba legislation and what the Canadians are going through at this moment. And I would say that we have what I call an irony deficiency, that Canada has wrested from Indigenous people, the first citizens, their country, and have treated them horribly. And they now are turning their attention to the Jewish community. And part of what's going on here is the history of anti-Semitism in Canada is this is not a recent phenomena. This is there's only been a very brief period of time, relative period of time, when Jews in Canada were relatively free of anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism came directly from both the French Canadian settlers and their religious perspectives, and the British settlers, colonial settlers. And it was exacerbated prior to World War II by British policies coupled with American policies, which made it impossible for Jews to escape the Nazis. The Nazis called it the final solution for a reason. They tried every other possibility to get Jews out of Europe and out of Germany and out of Austria. And the gates to immigration out of Europe were closed by the Americans and the British and the Canadians. And as Edwin pointed out, the Canadian representative to the Evian conference said, we don't want to import this Jewish problem, as did the Australian representative to the Evian Conference on Immigration in May of 1938. So in a way, the closing of the borders to immigration and the level of anti-Semitism, both in the United States and Canada prior to the start of World War II, was almost equivalent to the level of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. It was horrible. And part of the problem for the Canadian Jewish community is that they were relatively silent throughout this period. They didn't want to rock the boat. They didn't want to upset the apple cart. And for Jews in the United States, it wasn't until 1941, 1942, when it really became evident that the Nazis were mass murdering Jews, that Stephen Weiss and others in the Jewish community were able to, in May of 1942 at the Biltmore Conference, to start a real process to fight back. And we see this over and over and over again. Part of our problem is, as Jews, is that we have this kind of nostalgia for Europe, Ashkenazi Europe, and that we sometimes ignore the fact that we are one of the indigenous peoples of the Middle East, just like the first citizens of Canada are the indigenous people of Canada. And Native Americans are indigenous here. Jews were indigenous to the Middle East. We have a book, it's called the Torah, which documents more than 3,000 years of Jewish existence. Now, in 650 CE, a new colonial effort took place, and that new colonial effort was an explosion of the Muslim community out of the Arabian Peninsula, creating an imperial colonist empire from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Edward Said, in his work, the Palestinian literary scholar who took over Middle East studies from its legitimate activities, forgets completely that there was 1,400 years of Arab and Muslim colonization in the world that is still going on today. There are 56 Muslim nations in the world today, and 22 of them are Arab. They still exist today. They are part of that colonial enterprise. And during that 1,400-year period of Arab and Ottoman colonialism, hundreds and hundreds of ethnic groups, religious groups, tribal groups were destroyed and eradicated and assimilated and disappeared from the world. Yet, that is ignored completely. And the Nakba legislation, that's why I call it ironically dysfunction or deficiency, what are they commemorating? What are they memorializing? That they failed in stopping one of the indigenous peoples of the Middle East from restarting their national homeland. That's what they are commemorating here. Not racism against Muslims or against Palestinians, but that they failed in tossing out the Jews. And that they continue to fail is part of the reason of the Muslim Brotherhood that Qatar and Turkey are pushing and Al Jazeera is pushing today. So what Canada is doing now is taking a lie and making it out to be the reality, taking a half-understood colonial endeavor and ignoring that part and only focusing on European colonial efforts and ignoring Arab and Ottoman, Turkish, and Muslim colonial efforts. Because of that, we are in the position that we are in now. Academic programs at University of Toronto and most of the Canadian universities in Middle East studies have been funded by Qatar to the tune of, this is also in the United States, to the tune of more than $22 billion that have been given to these different academic organizations to foster this same lie that it is Palestinians who have been taken off their land rather than the other way around, that it is the Jews who are an indigenous people like the Armenians and like the Kurds and like the Assyrian Chaldeans. These are the peoples who have been persecuted and put down by this colonial Arab, Ottoman, Turkish colonial endeavor that is now trying to replicate itself once again.
These are very astute comments by you. Many people may hear these guys call the Zionists settlers, colonialists. Hey, Sam, how did they get from the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula all the way across northern Africa and into Spain and to take over the area that we know is Israel? That was the Islamic conquest, was it not?
Absolutely.
All right, so Sam, what are you going to do about it? Now that you know that this Nakba law is percolating, has a strong chance of being passed, and even if it's not passed, it'll be like the ethnic legislation in California. It'll be adopted by the schools, as we see from this major school system that is done in the right. What are you proposing that we do about it besides issuing a press release?
The Jewish community in California has been successful in arresting this endeavor because they spoke out, they created allies, and they moved forward in a strong way. They were not silent anymore. It is that speaking out, that forceful speaking out, that creating of coalitions with other groups that are being disadvantaged by this kind of approach. Part of the Canadian problem is that they have permitted into their country a group of people from the Muslim world who are unrepentantly anti-Jewish. I don't want to call them anti-Semitic. That gets into a whole other kind of program thing that I don't want to have to discuss. But it is anti-Jewishness that is part and parcel of their vision of the world, and that they forget that they were the colonists who had one of the longest held empires in the world for almost 1,400 years. We have to remind people of this fact. We have ignored it. We have permitted universities to ignore it. And the only people who are going to be able to push this are us from the Jewish community, and we need to say it over and over again. We also, as Jews, need to stop talking about ourselves as European or as Arab Jews or Jews, Mizrahi Jews, but simply we need to change and say we are a Middle East minority. And whenever we're asked to identify who we are, we say we are a Middle East non-Arab minority. Mr. Freilich said quite rightly, we have got to put more and more effort into fighting back in the public press, advertisements, all kinds of any kind of way in which we speak out. But the biggest and most important thing of all is coalition building.
All right.
And that has to happen.
All right. Thank you for these astute remarks. Shell, you have your hand up. Can you give me something in 30 seconds?
Yes. As Samuel said, the Islamic conquest, this Muslim conquest, that they're currently invading Spain, Italy, England, Belgium to a huge percentage. They've invaded Canada now. Our Canadian speaker, who's not revealed, said that they're talking about 5%, over 2 million more coming into Canada with a population of 41 million. And he pointed out, how do we motivate, I'm quoting what he wrote, how do we motivate Canadians to call their elected officials when they are so rightfully afraid of government retribution? We've already seen people's bank accounts close on government's instructions for voicing disagreement with public policy.
That's right. Very well said. Now,
are we seeing a fascist regime in power in Canada now?
Yeah, we are seeing a fascist regime in Canada, and that's what this show is about. A fascist regime with severe, invisible, and obvious anti-Semitic ramifications is arising in our loving neighbor to the north. Now, I want to do some questions here first. Chris in Indiana says, who is an astute observer of China, says China-linked groups have been connected to funding anti-Israel protests in the U.S. Is China also backing some of these protests in Canada? What does China stand to gain? And I will answer that if I can. The answer is China is funding this, both in the United States and in our northern neighbor, Canada. In fact, that's why our great Secretary of State Rubio is now canceling Chinese student visas. It isn't that China is anti-Semitic, because I don't believe China is anti-Semitic, but they're willing to fund and foment things that will tear apart our society here in North America. Let me go to
Edwin, can I add to what you said?
Please.
It's not just China, but it's also Russia. Both Russia and China are using this as another device for undercutting democracy, getting us to fight with each other for their own purposes.
That's right. Let's just say China, Russia, Qatar, and the usual suspects. Yes. Now, here's our watch party in the Villages, which is not far from where Sam is. And it says, what would satisfy you that Canada was taking proper measures? One, get rid of this Nakba legislation. Do not pass it. I warn you, do not pass it. Otherwise, my minority views will suddenly become much more palatable to people like Sam and Shell. I also say that we need to see law and order restored. We need to see bubble zones around synagogues, protecting people's right to walk into synagogues in the same way that they can walk into reproductive and abortion clinics. In fact, our own law also includes in that legislation the right for all religious institutions to be protected by a so-called bubble law. And we need to see the cops crack down on incitement hate speech, murder speech is not protected speech. Sam, give me a minute. What do you got?
Canada does not have a First Amendment like we do. And they can restrict speech in ways in which we cannot. And they need to be able to take advantage of that. That's an important thing. But more important than that is, instead of the Nakba law, they need to have a law which invokes the IHRA definition of antisemitism. I think that they've tried to do that. I'm not sure that they've been able to do that, but that's critical. There needs to be something done similar to what we've done with Title VI here in the United States in the Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, to go after schools, go after educational institutions, higher ed, et cetera, who are involved in anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic kinds of actions. And they're not doing that in Canada. Canada is becoming more and more like Ireland, parts of Belgium, areas that are part of this larger Arab Muslim colonial endeavor that still continues even today.
Sphere of influence, watch party in Newton, Mass. What if Roosevelt had done to Hitler what Trump did to Ramaphosa? Would Hitler have moderated? I'm going to just say a word about this, then I'm going to yield to Sam. I followed the Hitler regime very, very closely, and the one thing he feared was the boycott. And when it came time for the International Olympics to have their grandiose moment in Berlin, they actually moderated so much that some refugees, Sam knows this, actually, bizarrely, came back to Germany. So we need to put the pressure on. 30 seconds, Sam. What do you think?
Every time Hitler and the Nazis did a new attack on the Jews, they stopped and waited to see what the world reaction was going to be. When there was no reaction, they said, oh, good, we're okay this. Let's go to the next one. And that continues to be what happens. Silence is affirmation. Whether the community is silent or the Jewish community is silent, you're affirming this terrible thing. And you cannot be silent in the face of this stuff.
All right. Watch Party in Chicago did much of Canada's current attitude against independent thought critical of the government begin with the trucker crackdown. I'll basically say yes. Claire, give me 30 seconds. Do you think that the roots of this government crackdown lies with the trucker crackdown?
That certainly was a real turning point in Canada, I think. And it laid the basis for the kinds of, anti-civil rights, behavior of the, at that time, Trudeau government, now followed by Carney.
Now, our Canadian panelist, afraid to show his face or even identify himself, has made a comment about Canada's Charter of Rights. Would you kindly read that for us?
Right. He says, Canada's Charter of Rights is clear that the rights that have been granted can indeed be limited and revoked. Trudeau did that when he invoked the Emergency Act. That the courts later said was illegal, but the courts move at glacial speed, so its decision was a moot point and the damage was already done.
All right, so we're out of time. We're way out of time. I want you to hold for my closing word of wisdom, just 2 minutes away. But first, I want to thank my very knowledgeable guests. Sheldon Freilich, Sam Edelman, security pro Claire Lopez, and our anonymous Canadian friend. I also thank my talented international team, including Lance in Michigan, right across the street from Canada, Holly in Nashville, and Richard in the Philippines, as well as many others in numerous additional cities around the world. I'll see everyone back here in 2 weeks at 3 p.m. ET. You want to be a friend of the Edwin Black Show? Go to theedwinblackshow.com/support. Keep me independent. You want to hear me in person? Watch my website for events. Consult my events page at edwinblack.com. Until then, head over to any Barnes & Noble in the USA or any Amazon, Walmart, iTunes Books, Google Books, Kobo, or Audible.com platform in 190 countries across this roiling, toiling, boiling planet, where you can find any of my 250 book editions, such as IBM and the Holocaust and Banking on Baghdad, and for sure, the Farhud. Want an autographed copy? Hit edwinblack.com and click books. Get access alerts to participate live in future shows at theedwinblackshow.com. You'll see a much enhanced and exquisitely produced version of this show and prior episodes by subscribing to our YouTube channel at The Edwin Black Show. Click the notification button like tens of thousands of others have. Follow me at Edwin Black Book on X as well as Facebook. And now for my closing word of wisdom. Someone else wrote your history. Someone else is trying to write your present, but only you can write your future. I'm zooming out from our nation's capital. Bless all of you. Pray for all that is unfolding before our very eyes.